Good evening. No, thank you all for coming, and thank you those of you who will be watching this we'll be recording this. So if you have any friends or anybody who want to watch this later and couldn't come, we'll have the link out. I'm going to let Clay introduce himself. However, just wanted to let everyone know restrooms are over here. We do have some refreshments out there, coffee, tea, some snacks. If you want to grab some and bring them in, you're welcome to do so. And also, we like to remind people as well to please feel free to ask any question. This is a judgment-free zone. Be respectful of each other, and hopefully this will be a really good discussion. I'll sit towards the back. If you have questions, raise your hand so I can bring the microphone around so that when we're recording it, those questions can be caught on the, technical things. All right, thanks.
All right, thanks, Kristen. Hi, so my name is Clay Peterson. I'm a member here at Holy Trinity for a long time. I can't remember exactly the year, 2012 maybe. I also teach at the University of Iowa. I teach within the Department of Health and Human Physiology. I always kind of describe myself as a generalist, sort of a jack of all trades, master of none, but I teach mostly within human physiology, exercise physiology, biomechanics, and some other exercise testing courses. And so I'm not necessarily an obvious person to speak on the biological complexities of sex and gender, but it's something that we talk about like every semester in human physiology. We get to this unit on reproduction, and we talk about sexual differentiation, like how does someone become a man and a woman, or really a male and a female. And then we talk about, how can it go wrong? What can happen to make it end up as something different than male or female? And so I kind of knew about that, taught about that for well over a decade. But it wasn't until I had a student, about 5 years ago, it was actually, I think, summer of 2020, it was pandemic summer, and this student was taking my online human physiology class. And this student, Miles, had just recently kind of socially transitioned to start referring to himself as a man. And he had a ton of questions for me, questions that I didn't know the answer to. Questions about, like, how is differences in sexual development, like, how does that relate to the idea of transgenderism? What are some of the risks with some of the treatments that they might use for people that are experiencing this gender incongruency? And like most of the learning that I've done in my career, most of it's driven by good student questions. And so Miles's good questions really caused me to dig a lot deeper and to learn a lot more about this topic. And the more that I learned about it, the more I realized, I had a complete kind of misconception of what was going on with this topic before I really dug into it and learned. And so since then, I've tried to find opportunities to share that. I've tried to share that experience and epiphany a little bit with my students ever since then as well. But now hopefully I can share that with you a little bit. So again, I'm far from an expert. I know some stuff that I've figured out along the way. One of the things that you get from having a PhD, you certainly don't know everything, but you get pretty good at learning new stuff. You get pretty good at trying to find information and validate information. So I've spent a lot of time trying to find information. So I've read a lot of stuff and listened to a lot of stuff, and I can hopefully share some of that with you. I'm not going to have all the answers. I'm not going to have everything perfect, but hopefully you guys will enjoy this. All right, let's see if we can work this out. All right, so the first one, I had an embedded video that's not going to play. So that's what we were doing, messing around up here, trying to get that set up. And so let me share this video with you. Kind of curious how many of you have seen it before. So this was from confirmation hearings for Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. And this was asked by Senator Marsha Blackburn as kind of a gotcha question. And so we're going to start with this gotcha question.
Provide a definition for the word woman. Can I provide a definition? No,
Yeah,
I can't.
you can't?
Not in
Okay.
this context.
So you
I'm not a
believe the meaning
biologist.
of the word woman is so unclear and controversial that you can't give me a definition?
Senator, in my work as a judge, what I do is I address disputes. If there's a dispute about a definition, people make arguments, and I look at the
All right.
law and I decide. So I'm not,
The fact that you can't give me a straight answer about something as fundamental as what a woman is underscores the dangers of the kind of progressive education that we are hearing about.
All right, so this is just
Hey,
one
thanks
of
for watching. If
kind
you
of
like this video, check
many
out these other
examples,
videos from
excuse
USA
me.
Today to stay
kind of one of many examples of this gotcha question of how do you define a woman? And what's interesting is that the asker always kind of responds as Senator Blackburn did, which is if you can't answer this so simple question, then clearly that reflects something very wrong about you, right? But what's interesting, if you ever watch, if the question like gets turned back around on the asker, they never know how to answer it either. And so it's so simple, but yet no one can really answer it. And so I think it would be a good way to start here. If I can get that to actually advance. So what I'd like you guys to do is... So I click like 6 times before it actually starts responding and then gives me all 6 clicks. All right, so talk amongst yourselves and see if you can come up with what you feel like is a pretty good definition for a woman. And for some reason, people always talk about defining a woman. They never talk about defining a man. The man is just what the woman isn't, I guess. But we will go with the standard gotcha question, which is what is a woman? All right, so who feels like they've got a pretty good answer to this simple question? Who's got something that they want to share that they think does a pretty good job defining what a woman is? XX, yeah, XX chromosomes, sure. Although we will talk about in a little bit, there's actually situations where someone has XX chromosomes and does not appear to be, at least phenotypically or outwardly, a woman. And there's people that have XX chromosomes who actually are pretty much entirely men as well. So we'll talk about how that can happen. So that is maybe, it's one of the definitions that people try to come up with, but it's not perfect. It's also something that nobody knows, right? Like no one knows what another person's chromosomes are. So we could define people by their chromosomes, but no one knows what my chromosomes are. No one knows what your chromosomes are. So it's kind of hard to define people by something that no one really knows the answer to. What else do we have? Chromosomes is a good start. What else can we use to define a woman? Okay, so that means that anyone who's post-menopause is not a woman then, right? Because they're no longer able to produce a baby post-menopause, right? Or someone who maybe has had uterine cancer and has had a hysterectomy They are no longer a woman because they don't have a uterus. Okay, so you can see how even something that seems like a fairly simple definition, oh, this will work, becomes a little bit more problematic. Anything else you guys think will work? Physical characteristics, okay? And so we'll talk about secondary sex characteristics, things like breasts and external genitalia and those things. And again, we'll find examples where they don't perfectly fall into sort of one category or another. So, just take breasts, for example. If someone has had breast cancer and has had a double mastectomy, they don't have breasts. Does that mean that they're not a woman anymore? So all these things get a little bit tricky. So let's start diving into the complexity a little bit more to try to understand why it is a little bit of a tough one. I guess after I hit this, I need to just wait for... We'll get to the mental part eventually. Yes. Can we go forward from that? Give me my words. No, we went, So it was sort of graphics, and they're just going to skip right past that, huh? That's okay. All right, so before we get to this, and you guys have probably all heard this before, at least a lot of you are. So sex and gender are different things. And so sex is a biological construct. So biologists talk about sex. And sex is a collection of physical characteristics that are related to sexual reproduction. And so when we talk about biological sex, most people fall into male or female. So for sex, we use male and female as our descriptors. But as we'll talk about, there is another collection of categories called intersex or DSD, different sexual development. Okay? So that's biological, or that's sex, the biological construct. But then there's gender. And gender is oftentimes described as a social construct. So gender is decided upon, or gender is determined by sort of our own self-conception a little bit, and that is related to society and society's conceptions. And I heard this described in a way recently that I kind of liked. We're all just like a trillion cells walking around in a trench coat pretending to be a person. Okay? And that part about pretending to be a person, that comes from our sense of self, which is really bizarre because no one knows where sense of self comes from. Obviously, it's in the brain somewhere, but we all have these kind of conceptions about who we are, and part of our conception about ourself is our gender identity. And so gender is more of this kind of societal or social construct about our sense of self and how we fit into the world and how we interact with other people through this idea of man and woman. Okay? So through gender, we typically talk about man and woman, but as we'll talk about, that's not all there is for gender as well. People can be sort of non-binary or a-binary. So there's different ways to think about gender as well. Okay, so let's talk about biological sex first, because in many ways biological sex is easiest. Okay, so biological sex, we're looking at 4 characteristics. Okay, Fred named a couple of them for us already. We have genes or chromosomes. So typically a female is XX, and a male is XY. We also have the primary sex organs, or the gonads, females typically ovaries, and males typically testes. We have our sex hormones. These are produced by the gonads, so you've got estrogens for females and androgens, such as testosterone for males. And then we have our secondary sex characteristics, and so these are the things like the tubes, like uterine tubes versus vas deferens. External genitalia, breasts, hair, voice, bone and muscle structure. These are all our secondary sex characteristics. Yes, please. All right, so here's the stuff that I teach my human physiology classes about sexual differentiation or determination. So you start off with a non-differentiated or a bipotential gonad. It could become either. Okay? And usually about week 5 or so in utero it makes a decision. So how does it make the decision? Well, if there is a specific signal that shows up, it goes male. And if that signal doesn't show up, then the default is just female. You remove that signal, female is the result. Okay? So the specific signal is something called SRY gene. So that stands for sex-determining region on the Y chromosome. So the Y chromosome is sort of the thing that can disrupt the default. So if there is no Y chromosome, it's just XX, then that bipotential gonad becomes an ovary. We don't have any androgens because it's an ovary, not a testes. And so the male ducts disappear, the female ducts, uterine tubes, uterus develop, female external genitalia develop, and you end up phenotypically female. But in the presence of a Y chromosome, then around week 5, that SRY gene is expressed. And that causes the bipotential gonad to become a testes. Now, once it becomes testes, everything changes. Because the testes secrete something that causes the female ducts to go away. And then the testes also secrete testosterone, which cause the male ducts, the vas deferens, to develop. And then that testosterone is converted to dihydrotestosterone, which results in male external genitalia and eventually secondary sex characteristics. Okay? So that's how it normally works. Pastor Tim, you want to advance that? But it's not how it always works. There are over 50 known ways, different mechanisms, by which a person can end up with a mismatch between chromosomes and gonads and hormones and secondary sex characteristics. Okay, so the two most common by far, that up there looks different from what I have right here. So let's see if I can point it out. So the two most common ways by far by which things go, yeah, there we have one. Okay, so that's what I was talking about with what Fred mentioned earlier, the fact that sometimes XX could actually be male. There's something called crossing over that occurs when eggs and sperm are made, and sometimes in the crossing over process, it usually doesn't occur between X and Y, but sometimes it does, and you could have the SRY gene end up on an X chromosome. So you look at chromosomes, somebody is XX, but as far as anyone out in the world knows looking at them, they are a man. Because even though they're XX, they had that one little gene that ended up on an X chromosome, and now they're a man. Okay? Or a male, I should say. That's pretty rare. That's like a 1 in 20,000 births sort of thing. So it's not real common, but it does happen. Probably the two most common ways, can you go ahead and advance again, see if one of my, there we go. So sometimes a person has testes, but then phenotypically they look like a female. So what happens? They have XY, and they have testes, and they have testosterone, but they're lacking one of two things. Either they're lacking the enzyme because of a mutation, they're lacking the enzyme that converts testosterone to the more potent DHT, or more commonly, they have a mutation so that they're missing the androgen receptors. So you see the AR there? That AR is androgen receptor. This is called androgen receptor insensitivity syndrome. Okay, so they're XY, they have testes, they have testosterone, but they develop phenotypically to look like a woman. Okay? They will have a vagina, they will have breasts, they will have typical kind of female hair patterns, etc. And so that is fairly common. And then one more, Pastor Tim, please. The most common example of someone who is XX and has ovaries, but doesn't necessarily look exactly like that, comes from that source. Okay, so when we go XX, we go to the ovary. We don't have testosterone. The reason why we don't have testosterone is because you don't have any testes. And in the absence of testosterone, you don't get development of male ducts and male genitalia. Now I'm going to test your guys' biology knowledge here. The testes are not the only place that androgens come from. Where else can androgens come from in the body? Do I have any people in the medical field in here? Someone probably knows this. Yeah. The brain, I don't believe that there are any at least substantial sources that I know of. That doesn't mean that there aren't any, but not that I know of. Androgens definitely act on the brain, but. So we also have these adrenal cortex glands. And your adrenal cortex glands also produce androgens, typically in pretty small amounts. Like they play significant roles in females to like regulate libido and certain other characteristics, but they're usually in pretty small amounts. They play a pretty minor role. But sometimes you get something called adrenal hyperplasia, where the adrenal cortices kind of grow excessively and hence secrete excessive amounts of androgens. And so what happens then is this XX individual with ovaries all of a sudden has enough androgens that they start developing male external genitalia. Okay, oftentimes in this case, the infant will be born with what's called like ambiguous genitalia. Oftentimes the doctor's like, we're not really sure. And for a long time through history, either the doctor would just make a choice, the doctor would just decide, well, I think it's this or that, and they would do an immediate surgery to accommodate whatever they chose, or the parents, they'd ask the parents to choose, like, here's the deal, we don't know, you choose boy or girl. But gladly, in today's day and age, they're more likely to be like, all right, well, let's just hold on for a while and let this child develop a little bit, and maybe let the child come in on the process of figuring out if they feel more like a boy or a girl eventually. So all this is to say that there are ways that this can be different from normal. Pastor Tim, can we advance? So again, most people fall pretty cleanly into male and female. There is alignment between chromosome, gonad, hormones, and secondary sex characteristics. But roughly about 1 in 5,000 individuals are what is known as DSD, differences in sexual development. And this has previously been known as disorders in sexual development, but people within this community or who experience this, of course, are a little uncomfortable with you telling them that their sex is a disorder, right? So some people maybe look at it that way, but most feel a lot more comfortable just calling it a different sexual development. I guess you guys are supposed to pray for me. I'm not doing very well, apparently. Okay, so 1 in 5,000 doesn't sound like that much necessarily, but that means there's about 60,000 people in the country that this applies to. Okay? Means there's, how many people are in Iowa? 3 million or so? Okay? So there's like 600 people in Iowa that this applies to as well. Okay? So it is not a completely unknown thing. And in some populations, like sub-Saharan Africa, it's even more prevalent too. Much higher population, or much higher prevalence, I should say. So, you might wonder, like, what is it like for a person to experience this different sexual development? And I came across a TED Talk a few years ago that I think really does a good job of kind of illustrating this. So, if you'll indulge me, we're going to take a little break from me talking, and we're going to listen to this TED Talk that I have found very impactful. It is about 15 minutes, so this is going to take a bit.
I was 10 years old when I found out I couldn't have children. While other kids were on the playground or at after-school activities, I was at the gynecologist office, having genital exams, CAT scans, MRIs, blood drawn. I found out I was born without a uterus, and inside my body, I have testicles instead of ovaries. My doctors told me that I have XY chromosomes and that my body can't process testosterone. If you need a second to take that in, imagine what it would feel like to learn that about yourself at age 10. It was a lot, and it didn't end there. My doctors told me that unless I removed my testes, I'd probably get cancer. I didn't know it at the time, but this was something I'd hear over and over and over again from many different doctors over the next 20 years.
Using a toothbrush is my least favorite way to clean retainers. I use the dental pod.
If you wear your retainer every night like I do, you know how quickly it can start looking.
What I never heard from them is that I'm intersex. Intersex is a word that describes people like me who don't fit the typical definition of male or female. People who are born with differences in their chromosomes, gonads, ovaries, testes, internal organs, external organs, hormones. The list goes on and on. There are over 30 different ways somebody could be intersex. But my doctors never told me any of that. Instead, they told me that I had a rare medical disorder, that I'd never meet anybody else like me, and that I shouldn't talk about it. I should keep it a secret. I think they were trying to protect me from being bullied. At age 12, we learned about bodies in health class, and my teacher told us that girls had XX chromosomes and boys had XY. I knew I was XY, so that day I came home crying, and I yelled at my mom because she had never told me I was a boy. It made me feel like I couldn't trust people with information about my body, so like any millennial preteen, I turned to my best friend, the internet. It was a terrible idea. I only had the language doctors had given me, which means at age 12, I was looking up sex disorders online. Don't try that at home, please. The internet wasn't what it is today, and I only found a few articles and forums talking about people like me, and it was so negative. Everything made me out to be this gruesome, hideous creature, not human, not good. I cried for hours that night, and I didn't understand how this body I was born in could be so terrible. At age 14, I was hanging out with some girls from my dance troupe, and one of them had just gone to the gynecologist for the first time. She was telling us all about it, and they were so cool. They were older than me. I wanted to impress them, so I started bragging about how I had already been to the gynecologist loads of times already. It was a low point. I learned in that process that if I tell people about the good things, maybe they wouldn't have to find out about the bad. At age 15, I kissed a boy for the first time, went on my first date, but then I would have nightmares about what would happen when I told him my secret. I had this fantasy all worked out in my head that we'd fall in love and he'd propose, and that's when I'd tell him the truth. And every time in my head that I told him the truth about my body, he broke up with me. I rarely ever told boys my secret. I just couldn't risk what would happen if they found out. And telling girls was hard enough as it was. At age 17, I told a friend of mine, or I was hanging out with a friend of mine, and her boyfriend, when my secret came up. And it turned out she had already told him everything without my consent or knowledge. And I felt so betrayed. This was my deepest, darkest shame, my most personal secret, and I had trusted her with it. And it felt like I couldn't trust anybody, but I was a teenager, and that didn't last long. A couple months later, I told another friend, and she started crying and told me that if it was her, that she would kill herself. I comforted her and cried with her, gave her a hug. I understood. She didn't have to tell me I was worthless. That summer, I turned 18 and went to yet another gynecologist. And this one told me that unless she operated on my vagina, I would never be able to have sex. This was a couple weeks before I went out to college, moved hundreds of miles away from home, and I was so overwhelmed by everything going on that I decided to postpone the operation. This turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made because I later learned that she was completely wrong. It wasn't true at all. But because she didn't understand my body, because it was different, to her that meant it was broken and she needed to fix it. This wasn't the first time that had happened. All the doctors who told me that I would get cancer unless I removed my testes, that was a lie too. Or it was unintentionally a lie. They didn't understand my body. To them, it was broken, it was wrong, it was different, and they wanted to fix it. But I now know that my risk of testicular cancer is lower than the risk of breast cancer in a typical XX woman with no predisposition, no family history. But they never understood my body.
How can a Capital One 360 Performance Savings Account with one of the best savings rates in America help you grow your money? Set automatic savings rules to...
In college, I had a doctor present to my class about transgender issues, and I approached her afterwards and asked if she knew about my intersex variation. When she said yes, I started crying because for the first time in my life, I met a doctor who understood my body in college. When I called to make an appointment, she was booked out for months, but I knew it would be worth the wait. And in the meantime, I started dating the perfect guy. He was sweet and funny and nice and creative. I knew he was the one. But when I told him my secret, he broke up with me. Coincidentally, 5 days later was my appointment with that doctor, 5 days after the breakup. And I was a mess, needless to say. But when I walked into her office, I was surprised because she didn't ask me to strip down and put on one of those scratchy paper dressing gowns. A genital exam was a standard procedure for me anytime I saw a new doctor. And so when I asked her about it, she was confused, and her words still hit me in the gut. She said, "No, you have androgen sensitivity syndrome," the term they used to describe my body. "I know everything I need to know." And it was in that moment that I realized all of the genital exams I had were completely unnecessary. How violating that was, how absurd it was that my first instinct when entering a doctor's office is to get undressed. How maybe going to the gynecologist wasn't something to brag about at age 14. Or ever, really, if we're being honest. She didn't know for sure about me getting cancer, and so she wanted me to explore my options. I still wasn't sure. And so she referred me to two people, a therapist and a surgeon. When the day for my surgical consultation came, I got to his office, went into the room, and he performed a genital exam. My recent revelation hadn't sunk in yet, so it was still standard procedure. I didn't question it. It wasn't until I was getting dressed afterwards that I realized this was the doctor who would be removing my testes, which are inside my abdomen, nowhere near my vagina. And I realized he was doing a genital exam. He was exploring, touching, looking at my genitals just for his own curiosity. Every intersex person has stories like these. But unfortunately, most intersex people aren't as lucky as I am to have escaped all the unnecessary medical interventions. These surgeries and practices cause intersex people lifelong consequences. Pain, scarring, inside and out, emotionally, physically. for no medical reason at all. These surgeries are entirely unnecessary, and this experience with the doctor was unnecessary. But fortunately, I was seeing the therapist that the doctor had referred me to, and she suggested I meet up with other intersex people. So the next summer, I flew across the country, and for the first time in my life, 13 years since finding out I was intersex, I met other people like me. And not just a few people, but hundreds. It turns out, despite most of us being told that we're the only ones or that we won't meet other people, intersex people represent around 2% of the population. That's around 150 million people worldwide. And we all have similar experiences with doctors, shame, loneliness, pain. I thought back to that time I was 12 and looking up sex disorders online, hoping somebody would be talking about my body positively. And looking around, I was surrounded by so many beautiful, incredible, inspiring, healthy people, and I didn't understand it. If my body was broken, that didn't make sense, because that would mean the millions of people all over the world would be broken too. So 1 year later, I did the only thing you naturally can do when things need to change, and I came out publicly on MTV. You know, it's what you do, I guess. At the time, I was working with Interact, the leading organization here in the US that fights for the rights of intersex kids. And we worked to develop the first ever intersex main character on television. It was groundbreaking. Being able to see yourself, your story, represented in the media, to know you're not alone or have something that you can show other people, to validate who you are or to explain what it might be like to live in your shoes, it's life-changing. Since then, it's been 5 years, and I've been using the media and speaking to raise awareness about intersex issues, to fight for intersex rights and visibility. And can I just say that I'm tired?
What I hope to help you come to grips with, the outcome is inescapable.
I am. It's exhausting. When you tell somebody you're gay or vegetarian, people usually know what that is. When I say I'm intersex, that takes at least 20 minutes and a drink or two. Not sure if the drink's for me or them. Probably both. And when you've spent half your life ashamed, hiding this deep, dark secret, telling the whole world is still scary. Even today, there's this voice in the back of my head saying, don't do this. People aren't going to like you. You'll get hurt. But how many more intersex kids have to get hurt before things start to change? Before the rest of the world realizes that we don't need to be fixed? The idea that difference automatically means bad is what's truly scary to me. Our society is so afraid of people who are different than each other, than one another, than ourselves, that we shame or shun anyone who doesn't fit our definition of normal. This leads to doctors lying to families, parents choosing cosmetic surgery on their infants' genitalia, and intersex people spending their entire lives sometimes not talking to another person about their life, their story, their body. It's scary to me, and it's taught me that the only thing that truly needs to be fixed is the way we treat people who are different from us. We can do better. Thanks.
All right, so again, thank you for indulging me. I just really enjoy that. I think that is a very moving to me testimony about what that is like. All right, so that is going to kind of wrap up our discussion of the biological side of things, or specifically, yeah. Great question. I don't know that for sure. It would be truly bizarre if this was unique to humans because of the fact that it's a lot of like randomness, right? It's a lot of like mutations and it's things like that that are going to happen in every gene in every species. But I don't know, I can't speak specifically about like which other species we have evidence of this for or prevalence of that. So good question though. Any other questions? Yeah, Anne? So why is it not prevalent in Sub-Saharan Africa? I don't know. I mean, again,
This could be the hardest.
It's related largely to genetic mutations, and so they might have a higher propensity towards those certain mutations. But you actually see this a lot. This is a really big issue in sport, track and field especially. I didn't put anything about transgender or intersex in sport, but like international athletics that regulates international track and field, they've been trying to work with this DSD issue for a long time. Some of you maybe remember Caster Semenya, a runner was she from South Africa? I can't remember exactly which country she represented, but was a world champion in 800 meters in the early 2000s, and then ultimately got stripped of her medal because she was DSD. I think ultimately the medal returned, was banned from competing for a while, was then allowed to come back and compete. But this is something that a lot of sporting organizations have really struggled with, trying to figure out how are we going to deal with people who are DSD? Because there is evidence that they do, like someone who looks like a woman but has XY chromosomes in testes and testosterone likely has an advantage in sport. So, what do you do about that? Do you say to this person who has dedicated their life to a sport, you can't do that sport anymore? That doesn't seem fair. Do you let people with a competitive advantage compete against other women who are then disadvantaged by having to compete on that unlevel playing field? That's not fair either. It's a true ethical dilemma where there's no perfect answer to that. But it's one of the reasons why it's come to people's attention that there's such a high prevalence in sub-Saharan Africa, because there have been a lot of athletes from that area of the world that have been DSD and have been participating in track and field. So, okay. So it's different for each person. It probably depends upon like the degree to their androgen receptor insensitivity. So Emily Quinn, who we just heard from, I don't think anyone would look at her and think she was anything but, the same woman that we think of when we think about women. But like some people are very masculine as well. So if you don't have the same degree of insensitivity, then you're going to get some advantages from, or some of the secondary sex characteristics, even if not all of them. So it definitely varies from person to person. Okay, other questions? All right, so we just learned a little bit about DSD, different sexual development, and a little bit about the stigma and the ostracization, and how hard it can be to deal with. But in one sense, DSD is undeniable. No one can deny that you are DSD. Okay? There are blood tests and genotyping, and there are MRIs, and there are all sorts of ways that you can prove you're DSD. So if someone can't come up to you and say, no, I don't think you're DSD, or I think it's all in your head, or I think you're making it all up, we know that DSD is a real thing. All right? But things get a little bit more complicated now when we start talking about gender. Okay, so let's transition to that as we talk about gender. So, again, gender is kind of societal or a social construct. So most people who are biologically male also consider themselves to be men. Most biological females consider themselves to be women. So let's just talk a little bit about what we mean when we say man and woman. So, how does society conceive of a man? How does society conceive of a woman? And how have these constructs changed during your lifetime? So let's talk about that a little bit. Discuss amongst yourselves. All right, so let's just start hollering some words out. Man. What are some words we associate with man? Work, okay? Breadwinner, okay? What else? Sports, okay? And yeah, I think I heard someone else say strong, so strength, power, that is associated with the man. What else? Tall. Aggressive. Okay, lower voice. Facial hair, authority. Those are all things that we associated with man, okay, or with masculinity. So what sort of things do we associate with femininity then? Mothering, nurturing. What else? Weakness. Okay, Fred said it, not me. But I think that is absolutely right, like traditionally. But this is another good example how this construct has sort of changed through time, right? But maybe traditionally weakness. Yeah, so either not leaving the house to work, or if they are, then maybe nursing and teaching, right? Those are the things that they're allowed to do. I'm going to say emotional. Okay? Those are all things that have sometimes been associated with femininity. But again, I think some of these things have probably changed through the years as well. I would guess that a lot of the women in here would maybe be considered gender nonconforming 100 years ago, right? The things that you do today would not be acceptable 100 years ago, whether that is working outside of the home, having leadership positions, wearing pants, speaking up for yourself, defending yourself. Those are things that weren't considered feminine in the not too recent past. Okay? Got one more for you to think about here. How do you know that you are a man, or how do you know you are a woman if you identify that way? And are there ways that you don't think you maybe perfectly fit the societal construct of however it is you'd identify? Okay, so why don't you talk about that one a little bit as well. All right, so do you guys have good explanations for how you know you are a man or a woman? Does anyone feel like they have a pretty good explanation for how they know that? I don't. I have no idea how I know I'm a man. Okay? I think it's just that I generally felt fairly comfortable with what society defined as masculine roles, and because of that relative comfort, I'm just like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Everyone tells me I'm a man. That feels pretty normal, so I guess I'll just go with that. But I don't really know how you would even define it otherwise. Like, I understand sexual attraction. Like, I can understand who I'm attracted to, but that's a whole different thing from your gender identity. So, are there ways that you, yeah? We're actually going to get to that in about a slide, I think. So hold on to, the very next slide. So hold on to it in just a second. Okay, good question, though. The question was, how do hormones play into this process? So we'll talk about that. The short answer is they do, but we don't fully understand it. So, what about people who don't conform to all aspects of sort of masculinity or femininity? Anyone have anything that comes to mind? I like musicals. And I do most of the cooking in the house. So I guess maybe that cooking's not atypical, I guess, for lots of men. But maybe that somehow is a little bit non-conforming or atypical. How about you guys? Yeah.
When I was single, I remodeled my house.
Did you? Hammers and nails and saws and all that stuff. That is awesome. Yes?
Personally, I don't consider it a dichotomy. You're a man or a woman, or you're male or female. I think of it being more on a continuum. Be more masculine or more feminine versus your interests, your desires, whatever. Is that a reasonable way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, none of this is like hard and fast science, right? This is society. This is what we decide. And so at certain points in our societal evolution, I think we wanted to keep those two categories pretty separate. And I think in today's day and age, I think we're a lot more comfortable looking at it as more of a spectrum. Okay, I mean, maybe back when we were growing up, maybe we talked about like tomboys that like to do boy stuff who were girls, right? Or boys who like to do girl stuff. And at one point that was sort of stigmatizing, and I think it's much less so now. She's like, oh, cool, she likes sports, that's awesome. Okay? So certainly, at least within our society, right? Certainly not within all societies, but within our society, I think we have opened our definitions a lot more, and we allow people to live on the spectrum between those two poles, which I don't think we used to do as much.
I think it's still more stigmatized though for a boy to play with dolls than a girl to do sports.
Absolutely, yeah. Yep. So what Lisa said is there's more stigmatization for boys to do girly things. I'm not gonna, when the camera's off, I'll talk about. Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the ways you can figure it out. Yeah, but no, I think that's true. I think there's still a lot of stigma for boy if he wants to wear sparkly clothes or decides to take home ec instead of taking shop and things like that. It's not called home ec anymore, but what it's called these days.
I think the sport of ice skating is one sport that is that man really a man?
Yeah, and there's certainly been times where if a man decided to dress more androgynously or even femininely, where there would be a lot of stigma and criticism. Still is, for sure, but lesser so. Ron?
Social constructs maybe lead to stereotypes. And so when somebody doesn't meet that stereotype, then it just doesn't fit.
Yeah, and so what Ron said was that social constructs can lead to stereotypes, and if we get those really rigidly in our head, and then if someone doesn't fit into that stereotype, then that's when we ostracize, right? Or that's when we marginalize. And that's a lot of what this group has talked about, is how do we respond to those marginalized groups. All right, let's talk a little bit. I'm sorry, your name? Rebecca. Let's talk about Rebecca's question a little bit, which is, like, where does this live? And in short, it lives in the brain. and anything that's in the brain is ultimately psychology, not physiology. And of course, psychology is physiology, but it's physiology that's so complex we don't understand it, so we have to study it differently. Okay, there was a good quote, I can't even remember which scientist, neuroscientist it's attributed to, but I always think about it when I think about the brain, which is, if the brain was simple enough that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we could not. Okay, the brain is incredibly complicated. There is a lot of just basic stuff that the brain does that we still have no idea how or where, and this is kind of one of those. Like, we don't really have an idea where gender identity is within the brain, other than we know it's certainly distributed across a bunch of different regions. We do know that there are some broad differences between sort of the masculine brain and the feminine brain, but with tons of overlap. Like, if you could look at it, you can see differences in certain cortical regions here, or differences in hypothalamic volume there, but you'll find, if we think about sort of the two bell curves, they are broadly overlapping. You cannot take a look at a person's brain and figure out from that, oh, well, that's clearly a masculine brain, or that's clearly a feminine brain.
Isn't that what we do when we say a woman can't do math, but man can do math?
I don't know, in my classes, they're mostly women, and they're kicking the butt out of most of the guys right now, so, yeah, yeah. So what leads to the gender identity? This is where hormones probably play a role. We know that hormones do impact the brain and impact the brain's development, but it's not solely hormones. It's also so there's things that happen prenatally, perhaps related to the mother's immune system, certain antibodies, immune responses, inflammation that can seem to play a role, but things that also happen postnatally. Not necessarily in terms of like environmental exposures or influences. Certainly hasn't been any indication that like how a parent raises their child is going to have any impact, but there does seem to be genetic effects. So certain genes do seem to be potentially related to this. So if you have we'll define transgender in a little bit, next slide I think, 2 slides. But if you have identical twins, okay, and one identical twin experiences gender incongruence, then there's a better than normal chance that their identical twin that has all the same genes will also experience gender congruence. And then they usually compare that for control to fraternal twins, because fraternal twins are in the exact same environment, just like identical twins are, but fraternal twins do not have the same genes. They're just like brothers, sisters, okay? And so, basically with fraternal twins, there is an indication that if one of the twins is gender incongruent, the other one doesn't have any increased risk of that at all. Okay? Other ways that you can do heritability studies indicate that there is a degree of heritability to gender incongruence. So we know that there's genetic factors, we know there's hormone factors, we know there's other factors too, but no one's put the puzzle together. No one knows exactly what leads to this. All right, so let's throw out some definitions a little bit here so we can better understand what we're talking about. So gender identity is one's internal sense of self pertaining to gender. So again, those trillion cells in a trench coat trying to figure out who they are. So you might identify yourself as man or woman, or perhaps non-binary, or a very similar term as genderqueer. Now, there's other terms that people use for themselves as well, but I didn't want to throw so many out that it got overwhelming. There's also gender expression. So that's one's outward behavior pertaining to these gender roles. So we think about our clothing, our speech, our mannerisms, the activities we do. So here's kind of what we were talking about before, how we express our gender, masculine versus feminine. And then we can also think about sort of gender conforming versus gender non-conforming. If you are a man, do you mostly conform to the masculine expression or the feminine? And then there's sexual orientation as well, which is who are you attracted to? And so there's kind of a lot of different dimensions to this. So if someone is transgender, also known as gender incongruency. It just means that there's a mismatch between their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity. So maybe sex assigned at birth is male, but they identify as a female. And again, this is not just, oh, I want to be a female. It seems like it would be fun. Their brain is telling them that they're a woman. Okay? That is why there's a mismatch. It's not just like they decided to do this, but their brain tells them that they're a woman or that they're a man, just like your brains tell you that you're a woman or you're a man. We all have gender identity. It's just, it doesn't seem like a big deal when it matches. It only seems like a big deal when it doesn't match, right? So gender dysphoria is a sense of discomfort associated with this mismatch. So people can be transgender, but not experience gender dysphoria. And that's usually when they're in a very supportive environment, where people are like, hey, just be yourself, everything's cool, we love you. Then they are much less likely to experience the dysphoria associated with that mismatch. And people can even have gender dysphoria without being transgender as well. Okay, so you might be cisgender, but there's just something about maybe a secondary sexual characteristic that you have that you're just very uncomfortable with. And that can create some distress as well. So these don't perfectly overlap. There are certainly plenty of people that are transgender that don't have a lot of discomfort with it, but there's also people that have this discomfort related to their gender that aren't necessarily mismatched either. So both of those things can be true. Now, how do those relate to the thing we learned about earlier, DSD or intersex? So if you are intersex, it is not uncommon for you to experience some gender dysphoria because there might be some confusion over sort of what your biological sex is, right? Because it's not either male or female. But DSD does not underlie most transgender individuals. Most transgender individuals are not DSD. Okay, only a small percentage are. And not everyone who is DSD also is transgender. Okay, so they are kind of two separate things. Again, DSD is the biology, and kind of that people ending up in between the clear poles of male and female, and gender incongruency or transgender is a different issue. It's in the brain instead of in the gonads and the chromosomes and things like that. So they relate to one another because they deal with a lot of the same issues, but they're two very different issues. All right. So as we talk about the challenge of gender incongruency, I want you to think about this question. And you can maybe talk about it a little bit. Is major clinical depression a choice, or even perhaps a failing of moral character? Do you think that is a true statement? Go ahead, talk amongst yourselves. So I asked this question to my class too, and usually about 80% of them say, no, it's not a choice and it's not a moral failing. Usually there's still about 20% or so who say it is a choice or it is a moral failing. But for the most part, society has come to the conclusion that no, it's not a choice, it's not a moral failing, it is a mental health disorder. Okay? And yet, if we go back 50 years ago, the prevailing opinion would be that it was a person's choice, or it was a moral failing. What changed? What made this change in the last 50 years? So what do you mean by psychology?
They studied it and they said, this is just the way things...
What specifically was found? The role of serotonin. The role of serotonin was hypothesized in the 50s, kind of established in the 60s, and well known in the 70s. And once we could put a chemical to it, then people were willing to believe other people. But before we could identify a chemical, before we could identify a brain region, it was just like, nah, it's all in your head. Just snap out of it. Okay, you're just making it up. We are very hesitant to believe other people's lived experiences if they are different from ours and if they can't prove them. And it's really hard to prove something that lies up here. I mean, even depression, we just barely understand at this point, right? We found some neurotransmitters that relate to it. But as you've probably heard described, depression is like a whole basket of things that have some similarities that we kind of all lump together, but we still barely understand most of those things. But we at least have found a neurotransmitter. So now, I mean, going back millennia, people have had depression as long as people have been around. And going back millennia, they were always disbelieved and ostracized and locked up and institutionalized. And we don't do that anymore. And it's just because we figured out a little bit more about it so we could start believing people. Okay, so, I got a little bit of time left here. So, I wanted to wrap up about talking a little bit about transgender healthcare because I think this is something where there's a lot of misinformation about it. This is not my area of expertise, but again, I'm reasonably good at being able to like locate information and validate information and things like that. And so I have educated myself a little bit in this area, but I'm just scratching the surface, of course, for the people that specialize here. But let's talk about it a little bit. So there are a number of organizations that do have established standard of care procedures dealing with people with gender incongruency. So World Professional Association for Transgender Health, that's kind of like the worldwide gold standard. Endocrine Society, here within our country, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, and American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Okay, so they all have different standard of care, but there's a lot of similarities across them. So key guidelines that we see: the importance of informed consent for individuals and parents. All right, so there are standard care, standard forms of care that are available. We'll talk about those shortly. Some of those do carry risks. There is concern for people having regrets and things like that, so we have to make sure that everyone is really on board. And that's true, of course, in all medicine, but they're sort of extra careful about things with transgender health. Age-appropriate care is a really big thing. Okay? Children are treated very differently from adolescents, who in turn are treated very differently from adults. And then the fields are working really hard to emphasize the importance of mental health support without labeling this as a disorder. Okay? Just as Emily Quinn talked about with DSD, she doesn't want to be considered a mistake or a disorder. That's who she is, and she just wants to be able to live as who she is, and that's how most people who are transgender feel as well. It's not a mistake, it's just who they are. Don't call me a disorder or a disease. Just give me the support I need to be happy and to live a good life. So common elements of care starts with assessment, of course. There are certain ways that they try to assess if someone has experienced gender incongruence and then gender dysphoria. So there's certain criteria that they look for. Once someone is assessed as experiencing gender dysphoria, then they think about things like psychosocial support, counseling, and potentially social transition. So social transition just means maybe they want to be called Michaela instead of Mike. Okay, maybe they want to choose a different name, or maybe they want to use different pronouns, maybe they want to change the way they're dressed. Okay? So most, especially children, adolescents, that is the only care they will receive. Okay, they will receive counseling, and if they so choose, they might do some social transitioning. But there are other options as well. So for people that have a strong sense of gender dysphoria and are entering puberty, there is the option of using puberty blockers. Puberty blockers do not eliminate puberty, they just delay puberty, allowing a person to potentially get a better sense of who they are and what they want long term. There are some health risks that are associated with puberty blockers. There can be some bone health risks associated with it, potentially some long-term fertility risks, but that is another option. There's also gender-affirming hormone therapy. So if you are assigned male at birth, but you feel like you are a woman, you can take estrogens. If you are assigned female at birth, but you are a man, you can take testosterone. Testosterone works right away. Testosterone will make notable differences in secondary sex characteristics within weeks. Estrogens take a long time. Estrogens typically take years before they sort of have a cumulative effect, but that would be gender-affirming hormone therapy. And of course, there's gender-affirming surgery. So you've perhaps heard that sometimes middle schoolers these days, they go to school and they get gender-affirming surgery while they're at school without their parents' consent, and then they get sent home and they're a different sex. It doesn't happen. But if you're curious about sort of the rates of these treatments, that's what this graph is showing here. And so I know the resolution's not great, so bear with me. But for puberty blockers, these are prescribed for adolescents of pubertal age at a rate of about 10 to 20 adolescents per 100,000. Okay. Now, when you consider what the rate of DSD is, the rate of transgender or gender incongruence, the rate is about 1%, probably 1 to 2%. You heard Emily Quinn say like 2% of individuals worldwide are intersex. I think she kind of mixed that up with transgender, because it seems like roughly 1 to 2% of individuals have some form of gender incongruence. So if you consider that rate, we're talking about people that present to their healthcare provider as being gender incongruent. They receive puberty blockers somewhere around like 1 to 2%. So like maybe 1 to 2% of people that go to their doctor and say, my gender doesn't match my sex assigned at birth. Like 1 to 2% of those will get puberty blockers, which of course means 98 and 99% of them are not. They're just doing counseling, they're doing social transitioning perhaps. Now this represents gender-affirming care, gender-affirming hormone treatment. You see that doesn't really happen until later, 15 to 17 perhaps. And that's more like 10%, maybe when you have people that are still experiencing this gender incongruence by the time they get to their late teens. Now maybe say 10% of those might choose to have gender-affirming hormone treatment. Now if you're wondering like how persistent is gender incongruence in children? Children are weird. You guys know that? A lot of you have had children. Children oftentimes are just trying to figure all this stuff out, right? And so if a child expresses gender incongruence in childhood, like before puberty, there's a good chance that just through natural maturation they might decide, no, I think I'm good the way I am. The level of persistence of incongruence in children differs between males or boys and girls, but it's somewhere in like the 10 to 50% range, meaning the majority actually might desist by the time they become teenagers. And that's why they don't do hormone treatment for children, meaning like pre-puberty. They don't. It just doesn't happen. They don't do surgeries for children because we have lots of evidence that children are going to figure a lot of this stuff out on their own. Now, if you express this incongruence as a child, and then you get to be a 16-year-old, and you are still feeling this way, and you are very confident that this is an issue, that's why you see a higher percentage of these individuals seeking hormone therapy, because they're pretty sure by the time they get to that point, right? They've probably been dealing with this for years and years. We don't have surgery on this particular graph. If we did have surgery, it would be right about there. Surgery, actually it would be 0. So at this age, surgery does not happen. Pretty much unheard of. But once we get up to 15 to 17, surgery happens at about maybe 0.1% of people that seek gender-affirming care. So maybe if you have like 1,000 15 to 17-year-olds that are seeking gender-affirming care, maybe 1 out of 1,000 will actually choose surgery at that age. Okay, so it's very rare. It's usually top surgery. It's usually not bottom surgery. There's top and there's bottom surgery. Bottom surgery people usually save until they're an adult if they choose to go that route at all. Okay? So those are some of the treatment options available and kind of how often they happen. These rates change a lot when people get to be adults, right? When people get to be an adult and they have felt gender dysphoria kind of their whole life, they're a lot more confident in their choice to seek out these gender-affirming surgeries. So all of these, the prevalence of seeking out these particular treatments all go up a lot when people get to adulthood.
What do you say to a person goes to the government and says, we will not support transgender care?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me save that until we get to the last slide, because that will kind of come up with the last slide. So let's talk a little bit about like the evidence of efficacy. Efficacy means like how well does it work? So there's different metrics for efficacy because there's a lot of different things we can look at that relate to quality of life and if this is improving a person's condition or not. But the evidence is considered very low quality. Now, what does very low quality mean? Very low quality means that it's all observational. Okay, people don't do randomized control studies because if you have someone who reports to your clinic experiencing severe gender dysphoria, then you probably don't want to randomize them and say, okay, well, half of you will get a treatment and half of you will get a placebo, because that could result in people dying, right? And so it doesn't really make sense to do randomized control studies for this, just like we don't have randomized control studies for effectiveness of masks in preventing spread of hospital diseases. Because we have pretty good evidence that masks probably work, and it's not ethical to do a randomized control trial. Okay, you can't always do a randomized control trial. For those that don't know, randomized controls, like, well, we take a bunch of people, we have half of them have one condition, the other half have a placebo condition, and we see how they come out, but it just doesn't make sense in all contexts. One of the favorite articles I read as a graduate student was a tongue-in-cheek from the British Medical Journal about a meta-analysis looking at randomized control studies on the effectiveness of parachutes in preventing gravitational-related death. And their conclusion was, we could not find any randomized control studies on this topic, because not everything leads itself well to a randomized control study. Okay, so low quality means observational. It means, in general, short follow-up times. A lot of these, we don't have a lot of studies with large numbers where we have large follow-up times. And so that's what we mean by low quality. And it's true, we need better data here. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we don't have a lot of great data doesn't mean that this therapy is not effective. So what can we say? So these observational studies, with all of their shortcomings, we at least know that they consistently show strong to very strong improvements in that sense of distress over gender mismatch, in body satisfaction, and in life satisfaction. And those, to me, seem like pretty good metrics. How many people heard of the CAS review that was published last year, a year and a half ago in the UK or Great Britain? So it was a large systematic review that came out showing that we don't really have much evidence that gender-affirming care does anything worthwhile. But a large part of that was like they were looking at things that we find less consistently. So they were looking at things like long-term improvements in mental health, or like things like long-term decreases in depression, long-term decreases in anxiety, long-term decreases in suicidal ideation. And that's hard to find for a couple reasons. One, a lot of the point of gender-affirming care is not to decrease depression, decrease anxiety, decrease suicidal ideation, but it's to prevent it. So if you're looking at like changes from before to after, and a person was reasonably healthy and they got gender-affirming care and their life improved, and they didn't have suicidal ideations beforehand and they didn't have suicidal ideations afterwards, you'd say, oh, well, that treatment didn't work because there was no change in suicidal ideation tendency. So that's part of it, is they were looking at these things that the treatment is meant to prevent, not to cure. But another part of it is they didn't really control for a lot of social support. Because gender-affirming care in the absence of like a supportive environment generally isn't very effective. But in the presence of a supportive environment, it is much more effective. So we need more evidence for sure, but the evidence that we have is generally supportive of the idea that gender-affirming care is helpful. Another topic you'll see for people that don't want to acknowledge that trans people exist is some of this evidence for detransitioning and regret. So detransitioning means that you sought gender-affirming care, and then eventually you decided to stop gender-affirming care. And that can happen for all sorts of different reasons. The rate of detransitioning is generally about 1 to 10%, and again, it's tied strongly to social support. People that seek gender-affirming care and have social support tend to stick with it. But people that seek gender-affirming care and are not in a supportive environment, or this has been a big deal in the last couple years, people who seek gender-affirming care but are in real danger of losing their access to gender-affirming care are very likely to then stop. Now, if you switch what you're looking at from detransitioning to just regret, how many people regret seeking gender-affirming care? That's typically about 1% in most studies, which means 99% do not regret, are generally positive, and are glad that they sought gender-affirming care. There's, of course, kind of a neutral number in there, but I believe the numbers are usually about 70 to 80% are happy that they sought gender-affirming care. About 10 to 20% are fairly neutral, and then 1% tends to regret. But we do know from a couple of studies, the way they look at this is they look at people who are receiving gender-affirming care versus people who have been waitlisted and have to wait to receive gender-affirming care. There's roughly a doubling of suicide rate in people that are waiting for gender-affirming care and don't have immediate access to it. There is a much higher level of distress, of mental distress in those people that are waiting for care and don't have access to it. And so, Fred, were you the one that asked about, like, if we don't provide this care, if the government does not help support this care? Yeah, there's real harm with that. There's, as you guys I'm sure know, there's huge risks or huge prevalence of suicide in transgender individuals, especially transgender youth. And one of the big ways that that can be decreased is just giving them access to care. And again, remember, care isn't genital surgery, almost never in children. Care isn't even hormone therapy. That's 1 to 10% of children with gender dysphoria might receive that. Care is usually just counseling. And it is saying, hey, maybe if you feel this way, here's some ways you can sort of live it out in social transitioning. And it's very rarely kind of the scary things that people try to tell you that this care is. All right, so in the research, this is a very strong finding. This is my last slide. You guys don't have to listen anymore after this. There are 2 factors that are most consistently tied to positive outcomes. What do you guys think those 2 factors are? Support and access to care. So if a person has a supportive environment and they know they have access to care, they might not even seek the care, but knowing that they have access to care makes a huge difference. All right? And so hopefully through this, we have a little bit of better understanding about the biological side of things, the psychological side of things as it pertains to gender, and what gender-affirming care actually looks like in the real world. That's all I got for you. What do you guys got for questions? I don't know if I have a lot of answers, but I'll do my best.
You guys, we did terrible getting the microphone for questions earlier, but I didn't interrupt the discussion. But now, please raise your hand so we can have the mic, so the recording can pick up your question.
I tried to repeat questions.
You
although
did. You did a great job.
Didn't do all of them. Questions? Talked a long time. It's bedtime. Yeah.
So, who determines what access to care is? School counselors? If a 10-year-old comes to a school counselor and says, I feel different, does that school counselor have the right training to be able to send the kid to the right place? Or is it like, okay, if you feel that way, be that way?
No, that's just definitely going to be a referral sort of a situation. There are, I don't know if we have like gender health doctors in the area. Anyone know if that's a thing that we have here?
Eric, can you answer it? Eric?
I know good friend of Becky's, someone that I was a classmate with at Luther, is a like nationally known doctor involved in pediatric gender care up in the Twin Cities. But I don't know what we have around here.
Yeah, Eastern Iowa is not a hotbed of that specialty, but University of Iowa has an LGBT clinic, which is very hard to get into. It's quite a wait list. They're probably the local experts, and then there's a number of mental health counselors, psychotherapists who advertise themselves as specialists in transgender care.
Okay.
Transgender youth.
So
care.
there are some resources.
There are some resources for clinicians who aren't sure how to help people, and where you can send them. Yeah.
But by and large, those professional organizations I was talking about, American Academy of Pediatrics, Endocrine Society, they sort of set standard of care, but then like each state kind of makes their own decisions about like the level to which they're going to follow that standard of care. And you guys have probably heard there have been a lot of states recently that have been essentially just outright banning gender-affirming care. Now, I don't know what that means, and I don't want to catastrophize it. I mean, perhaps it means like banning surgeries, which is not going to affect very many people because not very many people seek surgeries in childhood. But it's probably not good because politicians probably shouldn't be making these decisions, right? Like this should be something that your doctor and the individual and the family, they're the ones that sort of know the situation and can make the best decisions. So I'm certainly a little uncomfortable with the number of states that have decided to just go against the recommendations of all these professional organizations that have put a lot of time and thought into it and just decided to ban it outright. So.
It's kind of like that lady said, though, you have to find the right doctor. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty important, I think, that you need to keep searching.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully we can make it so you don't have to search so hard, that it's a better known thing, and that doctors are trained in it just as a normal aspect of their training, so that you don't have to go through sort of the horrors of trying to explain your condition over and over again to a doctor who really should understand it better. So, other questions? Yeah, Rebecca.
I'm sorry, I don't do this, but what about systems out there or structures out there for supporting parents?
I don't know. I know.
Demystification.
So I know. I was talking to someone beforehand. I was spending some time on the California State Health website today, and they have extensive resources to support families who are dealing with a child, for example, with gender incongruence. And so I'm sure there's a lot of good web resources. I'm sure some governments are providing good resources like that, but I don't know what's available in that regard. I mean, again, a lot of it just comes down to kind of loving your kid and trusting that what they say is what they're experiencing and supporting them in that. I meant to share this along the way, but probably the biggest eye-opener for me with regard to my understanding, I use the word understanding loosely, but again, was another student that I had. And this student, Sam, was another female assigned at birth, but Sam was a man. And Sam came into my human phys lab, and was like super shy, very reserved. You could tell he was very worried about how he was going to be received, accepted, treated. And once it became clear to Sam that he was fully accepted within that space, his classmates were great, he just completely opened up. He was so funny, great smile, just a great personality. And like up until that point, I'd kind of been struggling with this notion of transgender and gender incongruence, because I kept thinking, like, I don't know how I know that I'm a man. I would have no idea how I'd know that I wasn't a man, that I was a woman. I don't understand it. And I was kind of in that point where, like, if I don't understand it, then I'm skeptical. And as soon as I saw Sam and how much he changed when he was just accepted, then it really dawned on me, something I should have figured out before, but it doesn't matter if I understand it or not. Okay? He understands it, and all I have to do is believe him. Believe that what he says he's experiencing is what he's experiencing. And if I accept that, then he can be his true self. And if I'm like, meh, I don't think so, you better prove it to me. No one can be their true self if they're sort of constantly having to prove that their lived experience is really their lived experience. And so if you are having a hard time understanding it, I'm still right there with you, because I don't know how I understand my own gender identity. I have no idea. But I also know that I don't need to know. All I need to know is that if someone says this is their lived experience, I can just believe them, and I can accept it, and I can let them be who they are, and then everyone is going to be happier for that. So.
Amen, amen. Clay, in response to the question about parent support too, perhaps we may have a chance to get more into that during Eric's presentation in April. Is that right, Eric? That's fair to say. We can talk more about that perhaps in April.
Excellent.
Learn more about that too. Yep.
All right. Should we all go home and go to bed? All right. Thanks for coming, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Clay. Great work.
Just a reminder that Clay will be present at our adult forum this Sunday to, follow up discussions, any further questions. You don't have to come. People who couldn't come tonight can come. Oh, Clay is grading us now. Fine. All right. Thank you all for coming. Next Thursday is. Oh, sorry. Next Thursday during the day, they will be showing the video of this. Yes.